Good morning, folks. How are you this morning? This is the Doug Rice Show. Welcome. Brought to you by Twitwear. That's what I do. Morning show as we groove into it. Tell your friends. Here we go. Oh, yeah, I like that. Twitwear's got some good stuff, folks. You definitely want to get out there and take a look at it. For goodness sake, folks, for goodness sakes. Hope everybody is doing well. I truly, truly do. Good morning. This is the Doug Rice Show. No singing, no dancing. I'm not doing that anymore. One of the reasons I've decided not to intro with my signature song is because at one point I felt I was on the verge of passing out. So I stopped doing that without a doubt. Now it's 8 o'clock in the morning. This is the usual hour of the Doug Rice Show morning show. I do a few more shorts or other shows that you might have seen last night. I decided at a late hour to read something involving the Black Hebrews in Israel, and I think that was a good read. Today, as we watch the world continue to just roll off the rails, we're going to go over something I think people will love to hear. Here it is. Racism and the psychological well-being of the Negro male in America. Now, you're going to notice that I did some adjustments. I took some liberties. I did. This African-American term, this term is now trademarked. Somebody owns it. Found that out this morning. And so I decided that the title of this morning's live would be Racism and the Psychological Well-Being of the Negro Male in America. I think it's a little bit more, a little more pointed when it comes to what we'll be discussing today. Do me a favor, folks. Like, subscribe, share, do all the things you do while I am on air. I do this now regularly. I do this every day, all day. I talk about Twitwear. I talk about the Doug Rice Show. I talk about the problems that Negroes face. And, I'm waiting to get out of this place. All right, so last night I've covered something regarding Black people in Israel, in the original Israel. Today, I want to focus on Black men. This show is for Negro men. Here's the reason why. There is a racism. There is a psychological impact on specifically Black men in America. I spoke to, I've been talking to people all day, so forgive my voice if it sounds raspy. It'll go away eventually. All day yesterday, all day before, trying to get the show in gear. And I mentioned to one gentleman the resilience of Black men specifically in this country. And I not to take anything away from our royal sisters, they too face discrimination beyond most ability to withstand. Any normal person would not be able to withstand what Negroes have withstood for 400 years. But Black men specifically have learned to thread the needle of this country, have learned to walk about unmolested only in cases where they are truly tactful, aware of their surroundings, and make all the right moves. Sometimes you got to be totally invisible as you are there. Sometimes you got to know when to say something and when to not to say something. And I'll tell you, the most important part of this entire thing is that Black men in this country specifically are not permitted to get upset. Black men in this country are not permitted to raise their voice. Black men in this country are not permitted to express themselves. There's a stigma involving most Black men involving their emotional expression. It's gotten so bad that each of us in our own way may attack the maleness of a Negro if it expresses himself in a way that may seem emotionally driven. And so by that, the psychological well-being of African American men, as the title states, is a delicate balance. And most who are not us have no idea how we do it. Most who are not black men, and I gotta say, a lot of black women are totally oblivious to what black men have to do, what we've always had to do in order to survive, in order to exist in this country. So today we're going to take a look at racism and the psychological well-being of the Negro male in America. We're going to see how it impacts us, men, black men. With all deference to our black women, you are absolutely welcome to sit in, listen in, comment. Katrina is there for that moderation. But it's my belief this information is desperately needed. I think it's beyond needed. So we're going to take a look at it. Here we go. Please like, subscribe, share the show, do all the things you do. Wait 1 minute. I just thought of something I got to do now. When I set this thing up, forgive me, I'm doing some readjusting here. Hold on. Whoop. Bear with me, folks. As you know, I am the only person who is in this studio, as I call it. And so I have to do all of the, there it is, all of the technical stuff. So I'm sure you guys can understand. All right, so here we go. Back at it. I want to be looking in the right direction when I start reading. So I had to make a rearrangement that was needed. Here we go. All right, now you see it. There we go. Again, I've renamed this for my own purposes because I feel the moniker of being called an African American is so misguided and it's a little bit, it's not really honest because we're not just Africans. And I dare say we're not Americans, but let's move on. Racism and the psychological well-being. Here we go. Whoa, make sure I got everything right. Boom. Introduction. Like, subscribe, and share. Here we go. Daily encounters with racism and discrimination can have both direct and indirect psychological and somatic consequences for Negro men. Yeah, that's right. I'm going to do that. For the most part, when psychologists and other social scientists have examined the impact of racism on blacks living in the United States, the focus has been on the indirect consequences of living in an oppressive society. Historically, the psychological and somatic ramifications of racism have been examined by focusing on the exclusion of African Americans from the economic, social, and educational opportunities of this society. And they quote the references. More recently, however, the psychological and consequences of racism and discrimination as experienced by Negroes on a daily basis has received the attention of researchers. Now I'm going to stop here and read the side. Let me see what it says. The current study examined the relationship between distress associated with experiences of societal racism and indicators of psychological well-being. The findings indicated that hostility was a significant predictor of racism-related stress for Negro men in America. Those with a history of substance abuse had higher scores than those without such a history, and African American men, Negroes, had a higher score than Negro women. The results of this study have implications for public policy. They certainly do have implications for public policy. Let me tell you, these kinds of studies establish public policy. You have to understand the people that read these studies are not necessarily on our side. Most, and I would say quite a few, are looking for the predicated reasons to restrict us even further. Understand that some of these exposés on the condition of blacks in this country, as they call us, give license to racist whites in power and allows them to further suppress our need to even grow or flourish. There is none of that permitted in this country for the Negro. We've been on a perpetually oppressive mark. These folks make certain that we are where they want us to be in this society. And they've made certain of this for 400 years. And they will continue to make certain if we stay here. That's just the truth. Let's continue. Racial discrimination in America. Chronic strain associated with the experience of racism has been implicated in the development of several potentially fatal stress-related diseases. The chronic strain associated with the experience of racism and implicated in the development of severe, potentially fatal stress-related diseases. And just because you see brothers and sisters walking about typically not in a bad mood or typically not stressed overtly, outwardly, that doesn't mean that the psychological markers of that stress haven't made an impact unknowingly to the recipient. I mean, when you approach someone and they do something that indicates a fear of you or say something that indicates they are trying to assert control over you, that is a psychological mark. And it's not done to any other group of people. They don't stop Asians that they see in specific places they don't want Asians to be. They don't stop and question individuals of any other demographic mark in this country other than specifically and more likely black men. Some doing their jobs in places white men don't feel they should be. Some white men are prone to come out of their houses with their sons chasing them down the street trying to deliver a package. See? So, let's go. So it's a pervasive, ubiquitous, and for many African Americans, the consequences of experiencing racism on a deadly basis can be deadly. On a daily basis can be deadly. Indeed, the chronic strain associated with the experiences of racism has been implicated in the development of several potentially, as we said, fatal stress-related diseases. High blood pressure, stroke, cardiovascular disease. In addition, psychiatric disorders, and an example given would be anxiety, depression, substance abuse. Lowered self-esteem, lowered levels of life satisfaction, and lower academic success. These have all been linked to the racial oppression suffered by Negroes, specifically Negro men in this country. Although racial discrimination in one form or another is a familiar to most Negroes, historically, it has been Negro men who have been particularly vulnerable to its deleterious effects. In fact, McCord and Freeman in 1990 found that the chronic experience of racism was linked to higher incidences of stress-related diseases like cirrhosis, cardiovascular disease, and homicide in men of the Negro persuasion. Moreover, these stress-related diseases have been implicated in the excess mortality and shortened life expectancy characteristic of the African-American male population. Alarmingly, McCord and Freeman in 91 made a report that said the average life expectancy for African American men or Negro males living in America in many urban centers throughout the United States is shorter than that of men living in Bangladesh, India. Now, you can't get much third world than that, but I want you to make that comparison and understand the pressure. All of us. I don't know that many understand how we are received. It's a very singular experience. I want to share it with you because most black men only experience this by themselves in the presence of white people. And it's involving how we are received when our presence is felt. And under certain circumstances, I can tell you it is a psychologically shattering experience because you can tell the difference in the attitudes of the individuals who have a problem getting along with others almost immediately. And it's expressed in a lone situation. It's usually expressed when we are completely and totally by ourselves. And I will tell you something. So many of us look up, look around, and wonder, does anyone see how they're treating me? Usually it's not seen by anyone. And more than the cases I've seen, in a group, in a crowd, their reactions are different. If other people there they may associate with Negroes are around and that same instance of our presence comes into mind, their reaction is a little bit different. But if you allow only a singularity of a Negro male in a circumstance surrounded by folks not us, you see the change in the temperature almost immediately, and it's palpable. Thought I'd share that with you, but the Bangladesh lifespan in comparison to Negro males in America is quite shocking, wouldn't you say? Have you ever been to Bangladesh? Have you ever looked at how they live in Bangladesh? It's no wonder they have a short lifespan. Let's continue. To fully comprehend the African American male or the Negro male experience with societal racism and oppression, a historic perspective is necessary. The debased and devalued status of the Negro male has its origins in the institution of chattel slavery. During chattel slavery, the Negro male lacked the ability to assert his rights, nor defend them from the harsh realities of slavery. Because the African American male evoked such fear in his European captors, he was often subject to harsh and brutal forms of torture, both physical and psychological. Do you understand where we sit within the framework of this country? Do you understand that as they look upon us, the same sentiment that flowed through the minds of their ancestors through the minds of their progeny? And likewise, I would say that the same inherent terror experienced by our ancestors is at oft times experienced by these lone Negroes finding themselves in the company of their ancestors. And I only point to a brother that might go on a camping trip with one of them and not come back. Following emancipation from institutionalized bondage through Jim Crowism and up to the present, the active assault on the African American male's physical and psychological integrity has continued unabated. In other words, it's continued and no one is considering stopping the abuse. Today, the brunt of white racial oppression continues to be experienced by the Negro male. Let me read that again. Today, the brunt of white racial oppression, the fear they have within them that drives them to oppress. I'll say this pointedly. Most live in silent terror of retribution. Retribution that's not coming at the hands of Negroes, but they look upon us and see their handiwork. And so through their minds runs exactly what they would do if circumstances were reversed. That's why they live in fear. All right, For example, black males are incarcerated at higher rates than any other group in society. The unemployment rate of black men, Negro men, is more than double that of their white counterparts. And Negro men are more likely to be the victims of police brutality or white mob violence. And so this is by design, this psychological assault on the Negro male. And it's a continuous, perpetual, never-ending assault that increases in intensity as time moves forward. We see the likes of Donald Trump exacerbate the racial proclivities of those who I don't understand, Alexa, of those who still hold such sentiments and project them upon us, now subtly, not overtly in most instances, but in any way that they can exercise their racial hatred against Negro men, they take that opportunity. You and I, as Negro men, have experienced this. We know when the tide turns. We may call someone for a job, sound very professional on the phone, and be told that the job's ours. Upon arrival, our Negro presence takes the effect I spoke of earlier. The countenance of those around you fall. The realization that the individual they spoke with on the phone is not the person they anticipated meeting. And we all feel it when we arrive. We notice what happens to their countenance, and we understand in short order what will happen next. We don't even have to hear what they say. We know the script. They'll tell you the job's been taken. They'll tell you, qualifications have changed. They'll tell you anything. And that psychological impact takes its toll on Negro men every single day in this country. And we withstand it. That's the miracle. Unlike our counterparts, we don't write 200-page manifestos and go kill groups of white people on a Saturday while shopping. No, we don't do that. We don't take out our psychological trauma on the populace causing it. That's the difference between us and them. In most instances, the pressures that black men feel in this country are held within, suppressed, acted out in other ways, but rarely will you find a Negro male take his frustrations out on innocent people. Can they say the same? I think not. All right, so let's continue. This is not too long of a read, but do me a favor, folks. Try to fill the need. I hope that you appreciate what we do. I am brought by the Twidware brand. I know you knew. And so if you like what you see, please go ahead and like, subscribe, share, and then, give to the giving links down there. Let's continue the reading. Here we go. Race and stress-related diseases. African American men compared to other Americans have disproportionately higher rates of stress-related diseases such as hypertension, stroke, cardiovascular disease, and substance abuse. In addition, African American men experience higher rates of suicide, homicide, mental illness, and incarceration than do their white counterparts. There is adequate evidence in the psychology literature to support a direct link between the stress that results from the experiences of Negro males with racism, or Negroes with racism, and those stress-related diseases pandemic in the African American community. So that I'm going to read again. I think it's very important we understand. There is adequate evidence in the psychological literature to support a direct link between the stress that results from the experiences of African Americans, Negroes, with racism, that correlation is there, and those stress-related diseases pandemic, that means run rampant through the Negro community. McNeil, Robinson, Anderson in 96 conducted a study to examine the direct effects of racist provocation on the cardiovascular reactivity of Negroes. So what they did was they conducted a study to see how racism affects the heart. They found that encounters with racism and discrimination resulted in immediate and significant increases in blood pressure, heart rate, and negative emotional responses. In essence, they're talking anger, hostility, resentment, anxiety, and more. Similarly, in a study conducted by Sutherland and Harrell in 1987, which examined the psychological responses of Negroes to racially noxious stimuli, it was found that exposure to racially noxious scenes resulted in increased heart rate activity. Well, I think we knew this. I mean, we're Negroes. We're experiencing these things, right? More than that, I'm almost amused by their wonderment that racist images increase heart rate in Negroes. Did you dial that in? Did you get that? Did you like double blind that and make sure it was? I mean, come on. I wonder what were they open to doing a study and finding how the presence of black people affect the heart rates of white people? Maybe I'm reaching. We'll keep going. Let's move. I'm just saying, it might be a good thing. All right, so these individuals found that the ubiquitous nature of racism and discrimination, let me find myself, had a negative impact on the health status of Negroes because it required them to live in a constant state of vigilance, a constant state of attention and vigilance toward any threat racially that might come our way. And you know, it's subsided and eased over the years, but I just imagine our brothers and sisters that lived in the 30s and the 40s and the 20s. I can't imagine brothers and sisters seeing, you know, hordes of white men on horseback wearing white robes coming to pay them a visit. Can you imagine the increase of the heart rate of those Negroes back then? Yeah, okay. As evidence, they cited two studies that found daytime levels of blood pressure similar for blacks and whites, but showed a smaller nocturnal decline in blood pressure for blacks. You're going to see that as a reference. The lack of a decline in the level of arousal for blacks during the sleep process, according to Jackson, Will, and Torres, may reflect attempts to cope with the omnipresence of racism. What an interesting word. And the omnipresence of racism. That is where Negroes reside. That's where Negroes reside, specifically Negro men. We are in an omnipresent racist state at all times. And listen, for those oppressors who claim to be on our side, that want to argue with me all day that it is not as bad as I say, I really wish you would just go away. Seriously. See, you don't speak for the people that are acting out, that look just like you. You don't do that. You tell us your take on the Negro experience and how well you cope with our presence. We understand that, we appreciate it, but more than that, there are those that don't cope so well and take umbrage and acceptance to Negroes in their orbit. And I invite these oppressors, these individuals who so desperately want to be in Negro conversation to, instead of reaching out to me to express how racist I am and how lost I am, I would want you to more or less go talk to your kin, your brothers and sisters, those that are, you know, bringing it in. You know, the tiki torch carrying, proud boy claiming, KKK clan, you know, those folks, you understand. So any conversation you might have with me about what I'm saying, do me a favor. Take some attention and put it to your own folks and start paying. Let's continue. The affirmation studies all point to the relationship between racism as an omnipresent environmental toxin and the onset of a stress-related somatic diseases. So that is an interesting way to put that. Omnipresent environmental toxin. That's what white rage is. That's what white racism is. That's what these individuals express, and that's what's being fomented by Donald Trump in this country. And they all seem hell-bent on a race war. I don't understand it. What were they mad at? What did we do exactly? Oh, we may have survived. That might be a problem for them. I don't know. Insofar as racism and discrimination can be viewed as a chronic source of stress for Negro men, then according to the psychological views of stress, the body's unsuccessful attempt to restore itself to a condition of homeostasis, that's interesting, results in the exhaustion of its immune system. Now that's interesting. So according to the physiological view of stress, wrong word, physiological view of stress, the body's unsuccessful attempt to restore itself to a condition of homeostasis results in the exhaustion of its immune system, probably other things, let's see. Yes, just its immune system. That's interesting. So the attempt for Negro men to recover from the day's incidents, from the day's encounters, from the day's interactions involving the racist ways of those we have to interact with, is such a stressor on the body, even at rest, that it affects the immune system. Consider that. Consider that when you go outside and wear a smile on your face. I mean, consider what you are smiling at. Consequently, when the body's defenses are overwhelmed as a result of an unrelated noxious stimuli, example given racism, tissue damage can occur. Based on the physiological stress paradigm and the fact that emotional upset is the most common cause of stress, the emotional reaction of African American men to the chronic strain of racism and discrimination, hostility, anger, fear, may result in the onset of deadly stress-related diseases. Now, who knew this? Psychological consequences of racism. Let's move toward this. According to Brown, in 96, he wrote the adverse psychological consequences, and I don't know if this is physiological, that's psychological, consequences that African Americans experience as a result of their daily encounters with racism and discrimination are to some degree related to the coping strategies employed in dealing with the onslaught of adverse environmental stimuli. Pettigrew in 64 posited that African Americans respond to racism in one of several ways. Well, let's look into this. They moving toward the oppressor, seeking acceptance into mainstream society. We have a lot of Negroes like that. A lot of Negroes that react to racism in that way. And Pettigrew in 64 saw this. Let's see the second. Second way African Americans, Negroes, respond to racism. Moving against the oppressor, a complete and total rejection of mainstream society's values and culture. I'm drawn to the second reaction. Let's see the third. Third reaction, moving away from the oppressor, withdrawal from the white world. Well now, third time's the charm. I'd say that is accurate. And if that was occurring in 1964, I can only imagine how that sentiment may have grown in all three responses. In the first response, in which African Americans seek full membership into society, an acute sensitivity and hypervigilance to interracial situations develops. This heightened vigilance and sensitivity is often accompanied by anxiety, hyperactivity, and occasionally by mild disassociation. So I think what they're doing here in detailing the first response they've listed, we now can appear inside the mind of those that don't hang with their kind. I think about the brother that just ran for governor and lost badly. Can you imagine the psychological stress of being amongst them by choice in an effort to further your own circumstances? Can you imagine the times you've had to steel yourselves against comments you've had to swallow because, hey, you're on the rise? And so when they move toward the oppressor and seek that acceptance, I can't imagine what they give up in return. But let's continue reading, see what else there might be to learn. So, characterized by this reaction as the schizoid nature of Black existence, in which African Americans must respond one way when dealing with the other African Americans, and another way when dealing with whites. Isn't that 100% right? 100% right. We do it some consciously, some unconsciously, and some of us that look upon ourselves doing it, we have a thought, right? We have a thought about what we see, but then some of us find that we ourselves do it too. It's kind of an interesting dynamic. So Pettigrew concluded that this racial role-playing, when carried to extremes, may culminate in mental disorders. So the back and forth, the dealing with whites and the dealing with ourselves, that has a psychological toll and may result in mental disorders. Interesting. Burke suggested several possible reactions to racism and discrimination that Negroes were likely to have. These responses were similar to those suggested by Pettigrew and are as follows. 1, adjustment, characterized by denial of self, blunting of emotions, and social withdrawal. 2, resistance, rejection of dominant culture, accompanied by anger, and possibly aggression. Or 3, reassessment and realignment. This stage cannot occur unless there is a shift in the forces that maintain racism. And Burke described a grief-like reaction that has been found among the population subject to racism. In this reaction, loss is the major dynamic that results from a failure to achieve at a level of the expected norm. This loss reactivates the despair of earlier losses and leads to anger and sadness, or it may produce a guilt reaction in the parents of the victim who fault themselves for failing to protect their offspring from the harmful effects of racism. Burke further suggested that this grief-like reaction in psychiatric classification is appropriately labeled as depression. He also posited that this grief-like reaction may go unrecognized in children. And so I point to the incident in Utah, where I believe it was a 10-year-old girl, 10-year-old Black child, 10-year-old Negro, committed suicide. She committed suicide because of the taunting of her white school children partners. And I imagine the parents who send their kids to school will never admit or guess that their child could push another child to the point of suicide, but this grief-like reaction going unrecognized in our children may in fact manifest itself in them taking their own lives. Do you understand the danger that we're in amongst these individuals? We're damned if we do get along, and we're damned if we don't get along. Like, subscribe, share, all of those things, folks. This is the Doug Rice Show. It's 8:39 in the morning on the 9th of November, 2023, and thank you so much for tuning in to see me. This is what I do. I do other things too. I delve into different directions, but I do this for Negro protection. You got to know this stuff. You got to protect your psyche, because out there, it's rough. All right, let's move forward. Fernando concurred with Burke on the experience and loss as a response to racism. Furthermore, he suggested that this kind of loss was more likely to occur in a subtly racist society that refuses to acknowledge the role racism plays in giving of jobs, medical services, or in the ordinary rewards of life. Fernando went further than viewing racism as an added stress experienced by members of minority groups. He suggested that racism serves as a pathogen capable of generating depression among oppressed populations. Simpson and Yinger, 1985, suggested that the pathogenic conditions in many minorities' communities led to opportunities for experiences of early loss, pain, and deprivation, which could imprint tragedy-seeking scripts into the personalities of Negro children. Tragedy-seeking scripts. What an interesting way of putting that. According to Pillay in 1984, living in a multiracial society where racism is likely to exist can result in psychological pain and stress for those who experience its effects. Well, the dots are starting to connect. Moreover, Pillay suggested that in order to infer a relationship between the racism and discrimination experienced by African Americans and the onset of mental illness and other psychological disorders, several assumptions were necessary. Let's see what they were. These include the belief that, one, a relationship exists between psychosocial stressors and non-psychotic disorders, neuroses, personality disorders, abuse syndrome. Let me tell you something about this. I'm going to pause there. When they get their clutches on us, when they sink their claws into vulnerable Negroes, this is when the sinister nature of these creatures comes to fore. I can tell you this because from experience, I've had to live it, so I can't ignore. When they get a hold of Negroes and they have control, that is when most of the psychological disorders put upon us take hold. This is true. And I think we need to watch for that, because what happens is they get their clutches in Negroes, and it's almost a felt obligation to torment and torture us. And if no one is looking at these abhorrently vile beings that exist within their society, they can do more damage in a short amount of time than over a span of years. And if it involves your child or your loved one or your elderly, you won't know why. What's happening to them is happening to them. That's why it's very important you pay attention to your elderly. You pay attention to what your children are saying when they come home from the schools you have the temerity to send them to. Let's continue. So these personality disorders, which is best understood in the life events formulation, that was the first assumption that they needed to include, that the psychological illnesses affect African Americans. Disrupted social circumstances affect normal development and may lead to personality disorders. Alcohol and substance abuse may mask treatable psychiatric disorders. Based on the unrelenting and insidious nature of racism in the United States and the resulting heightened level of vigilance on the part of African Americans, Pettigrew in '64 coined the term oppression phobia. He described oppression phobia as the expectancy of violence, mistreatment by members of the dominant white society, accompanied by feelings of complete helplessness. That is a carryover from slave times. You cannot grasp the complete hopelessness of the American slave in the 1800s. You cannot even fathom, as parents were ripped from their children, or children from their parents, and wives from their husbands, vice versa. And that itself is a psychological trauma passed down generationally. So the insidious nature of racism in the United States is permeating every sector of its society and continuously every day. So oppression phobia, the anticipation of violence, the anticipation of racist sentiment, we all have it. We all walk into a circumstance expecting that they're going to act out. And usually we're not left disappointed. And that's no doubt. So African Americans who reported having this experience of what he calls the phobia, oppression phobia, they, hold on, I want to make sure, reported as a choking sensation. They described it as a choking sensation, or the feeling of being punished undeservedly. They hate us without cause. Pettigrew suggested that a critical psychological determinant of the development of mental disorders within an oppressive system is the perception of relative deprivation, which he described as the discrepancy between the high aspirations of a person and what they actually attain. This phenomena is characteristic of U.S. society, in which the emphasis is placed on attainment of the quote-unquote American dream, while racial discrimination acts to bar individuals, particularly African American men, from its fulfillment. Take a drink. Goals of the study. There is a plethora of evidence pointing to the fact that African American men suffer from higher rates of stress-related diseases and disorders, high blood pressure, hypertension, stroke, cancer, substance abuse, higher rates of incarceration, lowered self-esteem, and poor academic performance in comparison to other Americans. Furthermore, evidence of a direct link between racism and the onset of stress-related diseases has been established. In spite of this, there's been little research aimed at examining the psychological ramifications of African American men living in an oppressive society. The field of psychology has, for the most part, ignored the urgency of the black male crisis, or has otherwise declined to examine empirically the psychological consequences of racism for African American men living in the United States. In short, they don't give a damn about us, and they never did. The current study is an attempt to fill the void created by the field of psychology and to provide some insight into the cumulative negative effects of racism on the psychological well-being of African American men. The current study examined the relationships between the levels of stress resulting from encounters with racism and indicators of psychological well-being in African American men. Specifically, this study sought to examine or determine whether or not the self-reported levels of stress experienced by Negro males in their daily encounters with racism would be related to elevated scores on measures of depression, anxiety, or hostility. Furthermore, the current study sought to examine the relationship between levels of race-related stress and substance abuse among African American men. Finally, the study compared the levels of stress resulting from encounters with racism between African American men and African American women. Now here's the method, the participants. The sample reported herein included 177 African American men, demographically representative of the target population of black men in the United States, and solicited from colleagues and universities as well as the community at large. And their ages ranged from 17 to 57, which with a mean age of 23. So the medium age is 23. So of the entire sample, 18% were from the community. Going to get into it. And the other percentage there were college students. The marital status of the sample included 86 single, 12 married, 6.6% separated, 0.6% divorced. For the entire sample, 32% of the participants were both students and employed. 11% were employed full-time. 4% were unemployed, and 52% were students. The average annual salary for the employed study participants was $18,000 a year. It is significant to note that of the total sample, 11% of the participants reported a history of substance abuse. Now, it's imperative that we know what they know about us. It's imperative that we understand. And I want the numbers. You're damn right. On demand. I want the details, because all of this serves as evidence to me that Negroes in this country truly need to leave. This alone gives great weight to that as a fact. I can't even think of anything else to say. Imagine that. All right, let's do this. The instruments. So, racism index. The development of the items for the racism index was based on the personal life experiences of the primary researcher in this study, an African-American male, as well as informal interviews and discussions with other African-Americans themselves. Okay, cool. Due to the innumerable ways in which racism can be experienced by Negroes, several criteria were used in the selection of items. One criteria for the inclusion of items was the frequency with which the race-related event was reported as having been experienced by Negroes. So, the example that you see here, seeing blacks portrayed negatively on television and in the media. I can't stand that. Second, an attempt was made to include these events reported as being a common experience among African Americans. For instance, being followed by store security. Who hasn't been followed by store security? Finally, it was recognized that although the specific nature of a race-related stressor would vary from person to person, common themes would surface. So, therefore, efforts were made to include items that sampled the primary experience. In essence, you have had to confront a white or non-black person about their negative treatment toward you, and that's of African Americans. Yeah, I've had to do that. To assess the content validity of the racism index, the primary researcher facilitated a focus group composed of 5 African American men for approximately 2.5 hours. In addition to evaluating the content validity of the racism index, it was examined for its efficiency of administration and any potentially harmful effects that might result from its completion. So they wanted to make sure we wouldn't be harmed in this experiment. The group members completed the measure, and a discussion concerning its structure, item clarity, item domain appropriateness, and the comprehensiveness of the scale ensued. Based on the focus group discussion, a final prototype consisting of 59 items were produced. So Cronbach's alpha for the racism index in the current study was 0.95. So interesting. Now you got to put this together, what they're doing. Multiple adjective affect checklist revised trait form. So this is an adjective checklist consisting of 132 items that sample traits measured by the following subscales. So they really delved into this: anxiety, depression, hostility, sensation seeking, and positive effect. We're going to continue. It's not that long, folks. Relax. By combining the first 3 scales, a summary score for the dysphoria scale is obtained, and summing the last 2 produces a summary score for the positive effect sensation seeking scale. In completing the Mackler, individuals are instructed to check those items that describe how they generally feel. The Mackler has undergone serious psychometric scrutiny over the last 20 years, culminating in over 700 published studies. The Mackler has frequently been utilized in studies related to stress, such as that resulting from ego threat, frustration, failure, and the threat of pain. For the purpose of this study, the researchers were only interested in the hostility, the anxiety, and the depression subscales. And there they have the scales measure. Now look, I don't need to go into the scientific details. What they've concluded, in my estimation, findings suggest that African American men experienced increased levels of hostility as a result of frequent encounters with racism and oppression. So, just to sum up their scientific gobbledygook, which is what I'm going to do, it appears that racism has a psychological effect on Negroes to the extent that all of these stressors, and I'm going to show you some of these. Look at how anxiety, mean, and over here, mean means medium, means the middle ground, and all the middle ground is in the halves. Very interesting. Now, I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to pretend to be one, but what I will do is try my best to see if we can get a general interpretation of the results. Let's see what they've said. The current study sought to examine the relationship between encounters with racism and indicators of psychological well-being in a sample of African American men. Specifically, the first order of inquiry was whether or not African American men who had higher levels of stress or distress associated with experiences of racism would manifest lower levels of psychological health. A measure, or racism index, was employed to assess the severity of distress experienced by African American men during encounters with societal racism and oppression. So they've done their work, and it looks as if they've gotten deep into the weeds, and I'm not going to get this deep. So what I'll do is end it there, because for God's sake, my voice is going. I want to see if they've landed anywhere specific. We can imagine they're landing, and so that's where I'll land, because you can certainly hear my voice and understand it's going to go out if I don't watch it. All right, so I wanted to offer that. And again, all of this is offered to you by way of donation. You guys should know that by now. We have a calculation sheet that we've put up. This, and I don't read ahead. I don't, and I'm not going to read till page 84. I was on page like 74. That's a lot to read. You can have this. I will send it to you. Simply email thedoughwrightshow@gmail.com, and you yourself can have this journal and finish it yourself, because I can't do it. All right, folks, I do appreciate your time. I appreciate you listening to my rhyme. I got to shorten my show length, huh? I do? Okay, I might do that too. All right, hey, I got to go. This has been the Doug Wright Show. Thanks for tuning in. I was going to do an hour anyway, so that's the end. All right. You guys have a good one. I'm going to outro the same way I introed. Not going to do the normal things you wait, because you know my voice has got to do this. So, all right, folks. Have yourselves a good day. Bye-bye.